In the early 1960s, the big three American automakers were neck deep in their war for dragstrip supremacy. Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors were pulling out all the stops to build the ultimate superstock drag cars in an effort to continuously one-up each other. Chevrolet had their 427-powered Z11 Impala, and Chrysler had their wicked 426 Max Wedge engine stuffed into the Plymouth Savoy and other cars. But it was Ford who would get the last laugh in this battle after swapping out their tried-and-true big block-powered Galaxies for a new experimental Fairlane that would make all the difference and catapult them to winning the 1964 NHRA Manufacturers' Cup. Their 550 horsepower, 11-second creation would turn the NHRA upside down. This is the story of the 1964 Ford Fairlane Thunderbolt. Before we can go into the Thunderbolt itself and why it was such a powerful force on the strip, we need to set the stage. In the early 1960s, the pony car wasn't even a thing yet. The Mustang, Camaro, and Challenger were yet to be introduced, which meant that the big three automakers would be duking it out with full-size cars primarily. Ford, for when it was competing in the NHRA Superstock Series in the early 60s, was primarily running their full-sized Ford Galaxies. Initially, in 1961, the Galaxy was powered by a hopped-up 390 cubic inch V8, which was starting to get routinely outgunned by the bigger 400-plus cubic inch engines from the competition from GM and Chrysler. By 1962, Ford had released a 406 cubic inch version of that 390, which was now comfortably sitting over 400 horsepower. And things started to go better for the Ford-powered superstock cars after this engine change, and they were actually beginning to win on a pretty consistent basis. Then, in 1963, Ford dropped their 427 cubic inch version of their engine to replace the 406, which is where the story of the legendary 1964 Thunderbolt begins. Now, the 1963 Galaxy Lightweight, which was the car that preceded the Thunderbolt, with the 427 under the hood, was a pretty fast car. The problem with all the Galaxies, though, was that they just had a little bit too much weight to have to push around for a racer's liking. Even with all of the weight reduction that everyone tried to do, the Galaxies at the lightest they could get them were just over 3,400 pounds. And for 1964, the minimum allowed weight for that class would be 3,200 pounds. So if all the manufacturers had engines that made similar power, then that 200 pounds of extra weight that the Galaxy carried could make or break its success. Now enter the Ford Fairlane. The Fairlane was a more mid-sized offering from Ford that had a serious weight advantage. Fully unloaded and dry, they tipped the scales at about 3,000 pounds, which meant that with fuel, a driver, and a bigger engine, these cars would be much closer to that 3,200 pound weight limit than the Galaxies were, which would give the Fairlane quite the edge over the Galaxy. But in order to race this Fairlane trim, they would have to build 100 road-going cars of the same spec to meet NHRA requirements. And the main elephant in the room with doing so would have to be the one under the hood, the 427. See, the Fairlane at the time was only available with a 289 cubic inch small block as its largest engine option, which, as you can imagine, is considerably smaller than a 427 cubic inch big block Ford. So in order to fit the 427 in the Fairlane chassis, things had to be shifted around, including the battery being relocated to the trunk, having the shock towers notched, and a custom set of tubular headers made that had to be routed in some not-so-simple ways in order to fit the engine in the engine bay, which now was very low on clearance. And the 427 that was eventually fitted to the Thunderbolt, specs-wise, was an absolute beast of an engine. On paper, they made allegedly about 425 horsepower. but actual estimates put these cars well over 500 horsepower, with some people even claiming they were closer to 600 horsepower. And based on the specs I'm about to share about the Thunderbolt's 427, comment down below about how much power you think that these cars actually made. The Thunderbolt spec'd 427 engine ran a stout 12.7 to 1 compression ratio. It had a wicked set of high-flowing heads on it, complete with a particularly nasty cam as well. Top all that off with two large 4-barrel carbs and a functional ram air style intake system that funneled air directly to the carburetors from the light deletes in the front, and it was pretty easy to see that this 427 meant business, especially when paired with a 4-speed manual transmission. But a 4-speed automatic was also an option, and with the 4-speed manual, a set of 457 rear gears were also available. Now, while the drivetrain in the Thunderbolts was pretty crazy, they didn't just get this slick drivetrain upgrade either. Even though the base Fairlanes were considerably lighter than the Galaxies were, they still had to strip these cars down to get every tenth of a second that they could at the strip. And some of this weight reduction included throwing the stock Fairlane seats in the trash and replacing them with the super basic flat seats from a Ford Econoline van, and pretty much removing every single thing from the interior that didn't necessarily have to be there. We're talking the radio, sound deadening, sun visors, armrests, and they even deleted the passenger side windshield wiper at that point because why not? They carried these weight reductions over to the exterior of the Thunderbolt as well, with lightweight fiberglass fenders, fiberglass doors, and that iconic fiberglass teardrop hood. Initially, they even put fiberglass bumpers on the Thunderbolt as well, but the NHRA soon said that that was not allowed, so they replaced them with aluminum versions instead. The 1964 Thunderbolts used 289 equipped Fairlanes as the base vehicle for which they would be built on, because they came standard with the Ford 9-inch rear, which was the only one that would be able to handle the consistent abuse that these cars would go through at the strip. And Ford was able to hastily build all 100 units of this car to make it eligible to race as per NHRA rules. 50 of the 100 Thunderbolts were built with a 4-speed manual, and the other 50 were automatics. The first 11 cars that were built were all painted burgundy, and then the remaining cars all came in Wimbledon white, which was also the white used on the Shelby GT350 as a fun side fact. But with all that work and time behind the scenes transforming the docile Fairlane into the ravenous Thunderbolt, did Ford get the payoff that they wanted? The answer is yes. They got everything they wanted and more. These Thunderbolts were about as close to a rocket ship as you could buy from the factory. 11-second quarter-mile times were very doable for the Thunderbolt, with some of the best times in period coming in at the very low 11-second range. Specifically, 11.08 seconds at 128 miles per hour is the lowest in-period quarter-mile time that I could find reference to. And in 1964, the Thunderbolt driven by driver Gas Ronda would even go on to secure the NHRA Top Stock crown. With a blistering start to its racing career like this, you might have thought that the Thunderbolt would have served a long and illustrious career at the highest level of racing. And while that may have been true for some cars, but by 1965, the racing space had changed, and stuffing these large displacement engines into the smaller, more compact cars that were coming out, and what ultimately would become pony cars in the future, which rendered the full-size drag cars no longer really necessary, giving the Thunderbolt just a single year of production. Today, factory numbers matching Thunderbolts are some of the pinnacle collector cars for Ford fanatics, with prices routinely fetching into the multi-six-figure range for a real one. which, while it's a lot of money, you are getting a piece of rare motorsport history for that money, and one that you probably aren't going to see many more of on the road. So if you ask me, it doesn't sound like a bad way to spend a few $100,000. But that concludes the story of the 1964 Ford Thunderbolt. If you guys enjoyed the video, we would greatly appreciate it if you could drop a like and also share this video with other enthusiasts. Also, please make sure that you are subscribed to the Rare Cars YouTube channel and smash that notification bell for more documentary-style videos just like this on the world's most interesting cars. Until next time, enthusiasts.